So the thing about, when you're introducing the speech, you said that, you put a question mark at the end of the title, right? And I like that because I like questions. And I have this whole idea about questions and answers, because answers cannot be eternal and timeless. Questions can be, answers cannot. Rules are answers. Rules are answers. It's basically do this, don't do this in this particular context. Either Islam is a set of rules or it is timeless and universal. It cannot be both. This is my claim. If it is a set of rules, then it cannot be timeless and universal. And from the first page of the Quran, you pick it up in the first verse, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Which means the first verse, the Quran is claiming that this is a book for all of humanity, Rabbil Alameen. This is from the Lord of all of the heavens, not only us, not only Arabs in the 7th century, not only Quraysh in the 7th century, but all of humanity for all of time. So this is a major claim. This is a major claim when you say that this document, this book, is a divine document and it is meant for all time and for all places. If it is the case, then it cannot be a set of rules, because a set of rules, as I said, is not timeless and it's not universal. There is actually quite a deep kind of philosophical distinction between questions and answers. Let me just take a break here. I think that some people are standing behind, so maybe we can create some space here for people to sit down.
Yes, please, please come. Yeah, we will.
You can sit in the carpet.
Can we adjust here?
So I kind of tend to speak of things as being question-focused or answer-focused. No, I just want to make sure you're not blocking the camera. Yeah.
You will fit.
We're tiny women, so we'll be fine.
Yeah. So as I said, when I speak about questions and answers, I'm really talking about something which is a little bit deeper than simply what we mean by questions and answers. You can be question-focused or answer-focused. Question focus, as I defined, I'm reading over here from my notes. Question focus is a tendency or direction towards seeing things as dynamic, relative, diverse, general, tentative, subtle, weird, random, connected, and continuous. If you look at things as a spectrum, the question side is always uncertain, but it's also curious, and it's difficult to completely define. Which is why it's always there, it always exists. Questions are eternal, in a sense. Answer focus is the opposite direction, because answer focus is this epistemic tendency to like things that are more absolute, more uniform, more static, more singular, more certain, more manifest, more familiar, more specific, and more discrete. This is a certain philosophical tendency that you're going to see repeating, and you can apply it across the board, by the way. You can apply it even to, outside of the context that we're talking about over here. But what I contend over here is that we have an answer-focused tradition. We're focused on answers. We're always thinking we like answers. The problem with there's nothing wrong with answers, of course. It's just that sometimes you're so beholden to an answer. You like the answer so much that you kill the question, and you stop asking the question. So our own conception of Islam nowadays emphasizes, if we go back to this claim that Islam is actually universal and timeless, our own conception of Islam actually emphasizes our difference. It emphasizes our difference in terms of, and I think it's important here to maybe discuss, or maybe point to the fact that we actually have kind of a crisis of legitimacy in Islam. Crisis of legitimacy in a sense of who speaks for Muslims, who provides moral leadership for Muslims, who provide political leadership for Muslims, and who are the social leaders of Muslims. And I'm going to give you some of the currents that are contending, let's say, who is in the race to say who is speaking for Muslims or who's defining Islam or who's providing social, let's say, leadership, not only political leadership, I'm talking even social and religious leadership to Muslims. And I want you to think in terms of two vectors. Number one is how universal versus cultural each of these is. Like which of these strands are more universalizing and which of them are moving in the opposite direction. And how many of these are contradictory with each other. First is official Islam. Official Islam is the official Islam of the states. And as we know, out of 57 Muslim countries, the majority are dictatorships. And in a dictatorship, we know that the dictatorship is, of course, a terrible state for, not only for economic development, but also for the moral character of the people. Because if you know, for example, that, to give you a very simple example, Jamal Khashoggi, who was a dear friend and a partner, the Saudi journalist who was killed and dismembered at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. When you notice that his own colleagues who worked with him their entire life, and they know him, they know his family, they are unable to speak for him. In fact, when they're interviewed, they either excuse themselves or they make excuses for the government that killed him. On the other hand, the Washington Post, where he worked for less than a year, everybody there is very committed to his cause. His own editor was crying on TV, and she cries regularly, actually, for what happened to him. So you have the situation where when you live under a dictatorship, because of your fear for your life, you're not morally free. You're always worried about what would happen if you do the right thing. And sometimes you justify it to yourself. So this is official Islam. This is the first strand, official Islam, which is the Islam of the states. And this is an Islam which is invested in shoring up the legitimacy of the states. The second is, and by the way, all of these titles are not exactly contradictory. Some of them are, but they're not exactly. They're not mutually exclusive. But it's basically jihadist Islam. These are the jihadist groups that actually claim to be. Of course, ISIS, for example, they actually claim to be the caliphs. They basically claim to be a caliphate. They claim the leadership of the Muslim Ummah. And of course, thankfully, they have been widely rejected by the world's Muslims. But again, this is a current which is trying to say that we are the leaders of the Muslim Ummah. The third is what I would call Salafi Islam. Salafi Islam basically is a populist strand of Salafism, which is in crisis right now. It's in crisis right now mainly because after certain political events in Saudi Arabia, their funding has been cut. So there was since the 1970s a lot of money going towards Saudi Salafism. And this has actually caused quite a reduction in the diversity of Islam across the world because Muslims across the world have been Salafized. But this has, they're living in crisis right now. It's very interesting to see what's going to happen in the future. There's also identitarian Islam. Identitarian Islam is that kind of Islam that emphasizes Islamic identity as different from other identities. In other words, it's talking about Islam not as a faith, not as a moral principle, but as an identity, as if it's a nation. Next is neo-traditional Islam. There's basically a strand of Islam which is trying to walk a fine line between being independent and being official. They are trying to resuscitate certain aspects of the tradition and reinterpret certain aspects of the tradition to make it more relevant for our current world. Sufism plays a big role in it as well. Unfortunately, they have been recently falling in the pitfall of associating themselves with certain dictatorships as well. Finally, there is activist Islam. This is basically the Islam of people who take up social cause. They're social activists, they're human rights activists, etc. And these people might not be speaking about Islam directly, but they believe that they're implementing the values of Islam in their activism. when I speak to a lot of Muslims, especially in the West, where I live, I mean, I did not grow up in the West. I grew up in the United Arab Emirates. I only arrived in the West when I was 37 years old as a refugee, as a political asylee. So it was quite an educating experience for me to actually come from an Arab, Middle Eastern, very much Saudi-influenced Muslim religious social setting directly to Norway, which is actually quite a secular country. Not even, it's like they're not even considering themselves the majority don't even consider themselves Christian. So it's interesting to see how Muslim communities are reacting in the West, and there is a lot of emphasis on identity. There's a lot of emphasis on identity markers. There's a lot of emphasis, and I'm going to maybe present you with this little distinction of what I call moral epistemology. In other words, how do we know, how do we define what is good? And generally, of course, there's not even, as I mentioned before, it's not only one. But I believe there has been some academic research that goes into what parts of your brain are activated when you talk about moral good. And it's three different dimensions. One of them is compassion. One of them, the second is honesty. And the third is disgust. I'll give you an example of an action which is honest, but not disgusting and not cruel. Sorry, dishonest, but not disgusting or cruel. Imagine that there's a bank error in your favor. You check your bank account and you have, for example, 1,000 ringgit in your bank account, and you know that this bank has probably like assets worth billions of ringgit. They won't miss the 1,000 ringgit. You can keep it. This is dishonest, right? But you're not hurting anybody. You're not exactly, you're not exactly killing someone, you're not exactly hurting someone, and it's not disgusting in a physical sense. So that's one example, something which is dishonest, but it's not disgusting, it's not, it's not incompassionate. Take an example of an action which is incompassionate, it's cruel, but it's not dishonest and it's not disgusting. Let's say you don't like someone, and you see that they're struggling, for example, to, like, they basically, someone you don't like, you pass by them and they're hanging on the side of a bridge, they're about to fall. And you simply refuse to help them. You're like, I don't like you. And they fall to their death. It's not disgusting, maybe it's morally disgusting, but it's not exactly physically disgusting. And it's not dishonest. You are actually quite honest, but it's very cruel, right? The third would be something which is disgusting, but it is not dishonest and it is not incompassionate. And I apologize in advance for the example, but imagine that someone who is a little bit sick, sick, finds an animal, a dead animal in the woods and has sex with it. It's disgusting, but it's not dishonest and it doesn't hurt anybody, right? So these are three different vectors over here, or three different spectrums. When we ask the question of which of these spectrums are universal and which of them are particular, the most universal is actually honesty. Because the definition of what it means for something to be true or false, honest or dishonest, a lie or a falsehood, a truth or a falsehood, is the same across all cultures. What's the worst thing someone is called in the Quran? Kafir. What does kafir mean? It doesn't mean non-believer. It means facts denier, someone who denies facts. So the Quran's own highest epistemology is based upon truth. The important distinction over here is that truth does not come naturally for us as human beings. Truth does not come naturally for us. Our brain lies to us all the time. In fact, if you study psychology, you know that part of your own perception is based upon your brain extrapolating information based upon what it expects to see. In other words, if your brain was completely honest with you, you will not be able to live. You will not be able to see because actually your brain takes a lot of information, processes it with what you expect to see, and then that's how you actually see and hear and stuff like that. So in a way, honesty the fact that the Quran is telling you that honesty is the highest moral value or the highest vector of moral epistemology in the Quran, of course it's not the only one, but it is very much emphasized in the Quran, is kind of telling you that, you human beings have an animal nature, and the Quran is there to elevate you from your animal nature. If you look at the second vector, which is compassion, compassion is, again, love, the feeling of love is very universal, but the expression of love is cultural. In some countries you might kiss and hug. In some countries you'll just give a handshake. In some countries different. The expression is different, but the feeling itself is universal. The Quran also speaks a lot about compassion, rahmah, about wood, about rahmah, etc. But the Quran's answer over here, the Quran's focus, is on rejecting tribalism. The Prophet ﷺ lived in a very, very tribal society. In a society in which your value as a human being, your obligations as a human being, all dependent upon which tribe you're from. Your worth, even the worth of your life, the worth of your property, it all depends upon which tribe, which group you're from. And there's a lot in the Quran to talk about. I mean, there's a lot. If we actually go into the Quran, again, if we go into the Quran looking for rules, we'll only find rules. But if you
have about 5 minutes for this.
Yeah. If we go into the Quran looking for this, looking for how do we counter tribalism, you will find a lot. There's a lot of information about that in the Quran. When we come to the third part, which is disgust, what makes one person disgusted is very different from the other. Disgust is actually very, very cultural. Now take this lesson and apply it to our own understanding of Islam today. How many Muslims will lie and cheat, but they will not eat pork? We emphasize disgust because it is the most cultural, because it sets us apart. The feeling of disgust actually, from an evolutionary perspective, the reason why you feel disgusted is because you want to avoid poison. You want to avoid something that might kill you. It's basically a sense which human beings develop because we want to protect ourselves from outsiders, from outside influences. So I'm not saying, of course, that we should not be disgusted. Absolutely, we should be disgusted by certain things. And certain things, again, certain things are objectively disgusting and harmful for human beings. But the fact that we actually de-emphasize honesty in our everyday morality, we de-emphasize honesty, we de-emphasize in our basically understanding of faith or religion, we de-emphasize honesty, we de-emphasize cruelty, and we emphasize I have to eat. We emphasize what we eat, sexual behavior, things which are cultural and things which separate us from other people, the way we dress, etc. And this matter of identity markers, I'm just going to add one example and then we'll do a second recess. When I talk about identity markers to Muslims in the West, of course the reason why people emphasize identity normally is because they have an identity crisis. Let's face it. A lot of our emphasis on identity is because we used to live in the world before. Our ancestors or our grandfathers used to live in a world in which who you are was given to you at birth. Even when it comes to what you work, your social status, your language, your religion, everything was handed over to you because society was developed like that. The society was organized like that. In certain countries, for example, like in India, they had caste systems where even your profession was passed on to you, and you had no choice of choosing another profession. In the past 100 years, so many systems of belonging has collapsed because of modernization. So a lot of systems that used to tell you who you are have basically been washed away. As a result, we have more freedom to choose who we are, but also this gives us a lot of confusion. Who are we? Identity is not a simple question. Identity is the most basic, the most existential question you can ever ask yourself. Who am I? And when we don't have an answer to that question, we cannot live a normal social life. The question will always eat at you. a lot of the rise of identitarian movements across the world, and you can see the rising across the world, not only among Muslims. Across the world, there's a lot of identity-based movements. It's because of a worldwide identity crisis. We are really living through a worldwide identity crisis, and the answer for that is not going to come from within. I mean, faith can of course help in figuring out who you are, but there's a lot of social factors also to solve. So it might not be the best. We might not be able to solve it. But last point here. A friend of mine recently shared a note where he's talking about the invention of an Islamic car. And I think this happened a few years ago. What is an Islamic car?
Honest?
That's the thing. That Islamic car was actually a car where when you open it, it says Da'a as-Safar. When you open it, it says Subhanalladhi sakhara lana hadha wa ma kunna lahu muqrinin. It reminds you of your salawat, the time of salah. It has a compass that faces the qibla. That is the definition, the person who created this is their definition of an Islamic car. And I'm wondering, why does it have to be that? I mean, why don't we say that a low emission car, a car that does not cause a lot of pollution, that's an Islamic car because that's an Islamic value. Because why? Because the Quran says that we are khulafa fil ard. We are basically, God has given us stewardship over the physical world, and we have to not pollute it. Why is it that maybe it's a safe car? Maybe it's a car that does not use a lot of gas. Maybe it's a car which is reduces accidents, etc. Why don't we associate that with being Islamic, rather than associate these identity markers and these things with being Islamic?
My name is Latif, by the way. Okay, you discussed about more on the cultural aspects and value systems, but to me, Salafism basically is a political movement. I mean, it is so politicized that it has become such a political movement that it has affected, I think, the Ummah to such a great extent. I mean, people are being slaughtered. I mean, we're talking about refugees in the tune of 10, 20 million now. And it's because of these ideologies that we are seeing this. So when you shift your focus on values and cultural aspects, I mean, it comes across as a social anthropological kind of approach. What about the political? Can you share with us that?
Well, if you notice, top-down rules, a rules-based faith is actually quite compatible with top-down rule, because it's, again, we're talking about subjecthood over here. There is a concept which I'm borrowing from Christian theology, which is called heteronomy, which is the relationship between you and the rules that you follow. Hetero means other. Heteronomy means you're subjected to the rules of another. The opposite of that is normally autonomy, which means that you go by your own rules. Heteronomy, the idea that someone else makes the rules and you have to follow, is, of course, you can see the political implications over there. Autonomy is what a lot of people are scared of. They're like, what if we're left to our own devices, we follow our hawa, we follow our own impulses, our own human impulses, the baser impulses. And what if faith has no space in our lives? But then there is a middle way, which is called theonomy. Theonomy, again, I'm borrowing from the Christian and Jewish tradition over here. Mainly because the Christian faith, historically, the Christian faith came out from the Jewish faith, and the Jewish faith was a legalistic faith, continues to be in certain, in certain movements, very legalistic faith. And the point about Christianity is that Christianity said that you don't have to follow the rules, you don't have to follow the laws. It's all about being infused with the Holy Spirit. So they use that word, theonomy. Theonomy over here, but when I try to apply the word to our own Islamic life, I found that it means something different, because it means being infused with the values of the faith. That you put those rules into practice in your own daily life. So basically, you are becoming a walking embodiment of the law, without someone having to force you, or someone having to subject you. Basically, the relationship is not the relationship of subjecthood. But about the political aspect, I think The fact that Salafism has become a political movement is a little contentious, because when I talk about official Islam, when I spoke about official Islam, I'm kind of speaking about that because official Islam has been painted a lot by Saudi Salafism. And Saudi Salafism developed, if we talk about historically, and I don't want to get into that because it might be a very long discussion, but historically speaking, it is associated with, these three concepts: orthodoxy, theocracy, and the aqa'id came together. And they can only come together because once you create aqidah is only like basically one set of beliefs. If you have one aqidah, it can coexist with so many different aqa'id. But if you want to create an orthodoxy, which means only one aqidah is acceptable, all others are wrong, then who's going to enforce it? You need an enforcing body, which is why you need a theocracy. A theocracy basically says, I enforce the rules, I select what is the right aqidah, and in return for that, I'm actually ruling in the name of the faith. And this happened in Islamic history, not at the time of the Prophet, not at the time of the Umayyads, but at the time of the Abbasid Empire. And that's another discussion.
This point actually on you mentioned a couple of times official Islam, and you had this sixth type of Islam, as you explained: official Islam, Jihad Islam, Salafi Islam, identitarian, new traditional, activist Islam. Just a pushback on that, because I think part of the discussion on Salafism should also be confronted with this fact that we also have democracy in the Muslim world.
Yes.
We have this book which just came out, Democratic Transition in the Muslim World. Although you said that there is a majority of the Muslim countries are in dictatorship, but I would like to challenge that, saying that in terms of, let's say, population, if you just name, let's say, 8 countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Tunis, Morocco, Turkey, Iran, you have at least some semblance of democratic institutions, elections are happening. That's already half of or more than half of the Muslim population. I don't know, where do you fit this discussion, this in the terms of this Muslim Democrats, which is from a rebirth of political Islam in my way, and how does it maybe challenge Salafi political...
Salafism is compatible with democracy. In other words, they're compatible in the sense that they're willing to... It's compatible with elections, let's say.
Okay.
With elections, the idea of having elections to select the next ruler, and Salafi parties, for example, in the Egyptian context, some of them were anti-democracy. They're against the idea of elections, and some of them were actually pro-democracy.
Okay.
So that will be another discussion. So, and I would say, because of the factor of time, I think maybe we should, delay it maybe till the discussion section.
Okay.
But just following up on your point, note that our confusion about what it means to be Islamic also extends to the political realm. Saudi Arabia claims to be an Islamic state. Iran claims to be an Islamic state. ISIS claims to be an Islamic state. That cannot be all true. So even our idea about what it means to be Islamic in a political sense is not clear. And if I go back to the question of the Islamic car, we can also ask a question: what is an Islamic state? Is an Islamic state one which replicates the models of the 7th century or the 9th century or the 10th century? Or is it a state which implements certain political values? In other words, in fact, there was I believe, an Iranian professor who I think worked in Ireland. I think this was 2014. He created an index called the Quranic State Index, where he wanted to look at all the states in the world and see which state in the world is implementing Islamic values more.
Yeah, Islamicity Index.
And what was the top country? Ireland.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Israel scored higher than most Muslim countries. And by the way, the top Muslim country from the list was actually Malaysia. And you can Google this. You can Google this and look at it yourself. I don't know if you continue the project or not. But if you go by Islamic values, the values of the Quran, the values of Islam, you're going to come up with a different picture. Because you're going to have to ask, which country has less coercion? Which country has more social welfare? Which country has more justice? More peace? etc.
So, if there are no other clarification questions, we can now move to the third section. Then we can open the discussion.
Yeah, so we have just enough. We just have just enough time,
Yeah,
and I think
minutes.
I'll keep this
20
short.
minutes, yeah, exactly.
Now, as I said, I prefer to avoid labels, but I'm sure that my Salafi self, if I was sitting here as I was 15 years ago as a Salafi, then there's a lot that I will not like, right?
What you will not like?
Well, anything which. Keep in mind that if we speak about, once we speak in theory, a lot of people will not have any problem. But once we speak about the rules, once we touch the rules and we say, hey, maybe this rule should not be valid, people will not like it, right? There is a recent controversy, for example, in Tunis about a recent law which equalizes inheritance for men and women, for sons and daughters. Mm-hmm. And someone looked at it and was like, the Quran says that it's actually the woman has to get half of the man's, because that's in the Quran. But at the same time, if you look at the context, this was a social context in which women were inherited. They were inherited as if they're property. In other words, they didn't receive inheritance, they themselves were inherited, right? So the Quran came to say, do not give them less than half. So the direction of the Quran was not to say they were getting too much. The Quran was not saying they're getting too much, give them half. The Quran was saying they're not getting enough, give them half, right? So the Quran basically implemented this social, like kind of an affirmative action program for women, to say that women are traditionally they have been disadvantaged, and therefore they have the choice of having they have the privilege. At the time, it was most certainly a privilege of having a male member of the family take care of all of their affairs financially for the rest of their lives, so that they have this welfare system throughout their lives. In return for that, when it comes to inheritance, because the man has more of a financial liability, he will get more in terms of the inheritance. What happens in our modern society when women and men are equal financially, or are approaching equality financially? What happens then? In that case, implementing the rule as it is actually becomes opposite of the intention. In other words, should we follow the rule as it is, or should we follow the intention of the rule? Right? The moment you say that, they're like, oh, you're actually changing the Quran. I'm saying, no, I'm actually implementing the Quran. I'm looking at what the Quran intended and I'm implementing that. But I'll give you some other examples of where when we talk about past facing versus future facing. Just yesterday, I was looking at examples of a new technology which is called lab-grown meat. I don't know if you've heard about it. Lab-grown meat is when you actually grow meat in a lab. You don't have to kill an animal in order to get meat. You actually take certain cells. You add stem cells to actually, at some phase, I believe you add stem cells to actually make the cells differentiate, and they become basically muscle fibers. And you can scoop them up, and then you can make a burger out of them. Okay? It's actually much more efficient than killing animals, and it's also not cruel because, as we know, one of the greatest sources of misery on the planet today is industrial farming of animals. I mean, the amount of misery that we visit on animals just in order to feed ourselves is enormous. What happens when this becomes mainstream? Would it still be halal to kill an animal for meat? I'm sure that some traditionalists will say, yes, it is halal. It has always been halal to kill an animal for meat. But will it still be halal when we have the option of getting meat without killing an animal? What will it do to all of the verses of the Quran which says that وَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ? All the verses of the Quran that actually say that in Hajj you have to kill an animal and distribute its meat. These are all questions, again, I mean, we are past facing, we're not looking in the future and we're thinking, what happens next? Take another example. We have technology right now where we can regrow a human limb. So if you lose an ear, if you lose a foot, etc., at some point, I think the technology is not completely there, but at some point we will have the technology to regrow a human hand and reattach it to you if you lose your arm. What does that do to hudud punishments, where we say that if someone steals, cut off his hand? What does it happen, at that time, at the 7th century, this was the most egalitarian kind of punishment, because it has the same kind of punishment effect on someone who is poor and someone who is rich. But what happens when a rich person can go, you cut his hand, he'll go and grow a new one, and a poor guy will basically just, live without a hand for the rest of his life? What does it do? Why, I would really love, I'm pretty sure that there are some Muslim academics that are who are working on these questions. But most of our discussions revolve around, is this halal or is this food halal or this food haram? I'm talking mostly about the European context, where there's a lot of disputes about, whether you should eat McDonald's or not, for example, or whether you should eat chicken nuggets from McDonald's over there or not. And I feel that if we keep avoiding these issues, talking about these issues, then a new generation is going to come that will not wait for us. The main threat to Islam is really not other faiths. It's secularism. It's secularization. It's secularism in a sense. I'm not talking political secularism. I'm talking social secularism, to the point that it doesn't really matter if you're a Muslim or not. You don't implement Islam in your life. And I want you to consider that if you make Islam all about rules, you're constricting Islam in your life. There are many people who are very worried about Islamic reform because they're afraid. They're like, if we take away all of these rules, then what do we replace them with? If we replace them with human intellect, then maybe we are making a mistake because we're putting our own human faculties into it, and this is not divine. But also, there's another questions like, those values, where are they coming from? Maybe we're putting Western values into Islam then, or Western assumptions or prejudices into Islam. So we're basically afraid of reform for this reason. We're afraid of talking about reform because we're afraid that what happens when we have to use our brains. I'm not saying I'm not saying it in a bad way. I'm saying that it is a threat. Whenever you actually have to use your brain, you need a threat. And this is why I started the discussion by saying that we need an objective value system. And this is the key question. Is there an objective value system in the Quran? My answer is yes, absolutely. If you go to the Quran, and if we develop a methodology, or we put our heads together and we say, we need a specific way in which we go to the Quran and we don't look for rules, we look for values. It is absolutely possible to do that, and the number of values is not going to be 1,000 or 2,000. You're going to find a coherent set of core values. And once we say that these are the values in the Quran, these are the values that we have to put in our lives, and we have to put them into our political systems, our businesses, our schools, etc., I believe the effect is going to be a reinvigoration of Islam rather than a sidelining of Islam. So when I say that, what I think should happen, the first I would say is that we need to put a stopgap on certain traditional fatwas. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I grew up in a Sunni background, but I don't consider myself Sunni or Shia. After studying Islamic tradition, I find that there's wisdom in both sides. So I don't consider myself Sunni or Shia. I would be lying if I say that I'm Sunni or Shia from a theological point of view. I simply call myself Muslim, and I believe that's the intention also for us as Muslims. But I don't know if you're aware that in the Shia school, you are not allowed to follow the fatwa of someone who's dead. You're not allowed to follow the fatwa of a man who died. You're only allowed to do that if he used to be alive and then he died, and then you continue because you're 50, 60 years old. You're not going to change everything because you're not going to find a new marja. And I'm not sure. I'm not aware. I'm happy to be corrected on that, but I'm not sure whether this is a mainstream position among all Shias or this is certain Shias. But this is the reason why the Shia clerical establishment is more dynamic than the Sunni clerical establishment, because they always need a cleric. every generation needs to have its own clerics who reinterpret everything in terms of current events. If we implement that, and this is, of course, they also have their own evidence, they have their own adillah for this, etc. If we actually do this, on the one hand, we're actually invalidating a lot of ijma', past ijma'. I'll give you a very simple example of that. It is a matter of ijma' among a lot of traditionists, and I say a lot over here, you know, with an asterisk, that rebelling against a leader is haram. No matter how bad he is, no matter how, you know, it's good. Again, I mean, they refer to a hadith that says, even if he lashes you and steals your money, you're still supposed to obey the leader. The context of this, or the reason why there was a certain, I mean, forget about the hadith, because the hadith actually is not completely agreed upon, but it was an ijma' at a certain point that if you create rebellion, then rebellion is going to cause more harm than good. But we are in a world today when we actually know that actually it's dictatorship that causes more harm than good. In fact, if you don't rebel, if you don't stand up to a dictator, if he knows that nobody is standing in his face, it's going to cause more destruction, and it's going to destroy more lives, because it's going to, instead of lasting for 2 or 3 years, it's going to last for 40, 50 years. So this is an example of a past, you know, it's a past ijma' that is not valid anymore. Or maybe it is, but in that case, let's discuss it again. So that's one thing that we can borrow. If we borrow that, or if we implement that, then actually we are creating a new layer of tradition, or we're forcing the creation of a new layer of tradition. At the same time, if we invalidate, or if we, not invalidate, but let's say if we call into question any rule that is out of context, out of social context, like let's say, for example, I mentioned, for example, the rules about male guardianship and inheritance rules, because again, I'm saying that the social context, the socio-economic context at the time was different. But also you can apply this to, let's say, slavery verses. Lots of verses of the Quran deal with slavery. And of course, all of them is actually talking about freeing slaves, right? If we don't, because we didn't deal with this and we did not actually have an ijma', a new ijma' saying these are not valid for today's world anymore. This was a project that was completed. The Quran does not like slavery. The Quran coexists with slavery because it was a problem that existed at the time. And we have to take these values and implement them in our world today. And we have to look who is underprivileged today, who is unfree today. There's another, basically, there's no formal slavery, there's no chattel slavery in the world, but there's other forms of slavery that we have to speak about. In that case, maybe when ISIS comes around, ISIS will not be able to say, yeah, I'm going to bring back this tradition because it's actually sunnah. Right? Because that's what they believe themselves to be doing. They're saying that we're bringing back slavery, and slavery used to be sunnah because it's in the Quran. And I don't want to give ISIS over here a bigger space than they deserve. I mean, ISIS they are definitely a fringe group, but this is why they were able to capture. My question becomes, why did they convince so many people? Why did so many people become convinced by these arguments? Why didn't they immediately say this is nonsense? So as I said, we also need kind of a methodology to extract values. I think Professor Fazlur Rahman, who, he's not with us, his long past, but his work on this topic has been quite influential, and I think we need to pick up on that. I tried actually looking in the Quran, going to the Quran, and only looking for any word which comes after la'alla. La'alla means such as it may. It gives a reason, it gives a cause. So basically it says, it would say, for example, that God asked you to do this لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ or لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. It's basically giving you ghayat. It's giving you basically the intention of these verses, right? It's basically saying that I asked you to do this, and this is the intention. I asked you to do this, and this is the intention. In the end, I can understand that. I mean, I can intellectually understand that some of these things were ordered in a certain socio-political world 1500 years ago. But the intention is what should we, I mean, our focus should be on the intention. Our focus should be is, why did the God ask them to do that? Well, He already gave us that. He said, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَذَكَّرُونَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَفَكَّرُونَ, right? And I think eventually, I mean, the last point over here, so that we can have, you know, a good space for discussion. I think we should realize that what is Islamic and what is universal are the same thing. Unfortunately, right now, when we say Islamic, we mean something unique and different. And this attitude is un-Islamic because it goes against the Quran. The Quran is saying that this is a book for all humanity for all time. It cannot be both a book for all humanity for all time and a book of rules only. We are programmed to look for rules. Incidentally over here, if we try to make it work the other way, if we actually try to say, no, it is a book of rules, and it is timeless, and it is universal, you know what we're going to end up doing? We're going to end up doing what the Western world did with globalization. So you see there's a difference between universalism and globalization. Universalism means that we're going to look at the universal values of all humanity, and we're going to emphasize that as the core values that we agree upon. And a beautiful document that was created by the UN, the UN Declaration for Human Rights, last century, basically captured a lot of that, and a lot of Muslim countries were signatories to that, or actually, you know, at the, you know, even working on developing that. However, globalization is different. Globalization is when I take one, you know, what do you say, value system for one culture, and I impose it on everybody else. And I say now it's global. So in other words, a lot of Islamists, in this case, when they talk about globalization, universalization of Islam or globalization of Islam, they're saying we want to take that Islam, which is specific to one culture and time, that set of rules, and we're going to impose it on everybody. In other words, we want everybody to look like us, eat like us, talk like us, etc., and follow the same rules. And as I say, this is like kind of, the attitude itself is un-Islamic. The Quran itself is, if you and I remember an incident where, this was back when I used to live in the United Arab Emirates, and every Ramadan I used to go for i'tikaf at the end of the Ramadan, last 10 days. And I remember one of those years, I did not have access to a lot of references. I was reading the Quran, and I decided that I want to read the Quran as if it's a book, not as a recitation, not to recite it, but rather read it as if I'm actually reading a book of philosophy or a book of, you know, philosophical novel or something like that. Stop at every verse and think deeply about it. And, you know, of course, it both went well and it did not go well. It went very, very well in a sense that it was an amazing experience, but also in the entire month, I only ended with 40 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah. And I ended up with more notes, like more written notes than what I read, like basically more than 80 pages of notes. Because it's a book that struggles with you. It's a book full of questions. It forces you to think. It's a spiritual book in a sense that it makes you struggle with a lot of questions. And one thing that you notice is that it's a book that does not have favorites. It does not favor you just because you're Arab or just because you're Muslim. It doesn't, you know, God does not look at you differently just because you're from a different tribe or your parents came from a different place or etc. The next year, I had the good fortune of having more references. And some of the references are basically by, you know, some of the greatest, you know, tafasir. And I tried doing this again and it didn't go well. It didn't go well. Why? Because I had access to so many different ideas and I disrespected my own ideas. I basically said, you know, what is my tafsir of this verse in front of, you know, Al-Razi and Al-Alusi and you know, those great mufassirin. In a sense, having this great tradition is both a gift and a curse. It's a gift because you have access to so much tradition, so many ideas, so many, opinions of really spiritual, great people. But at the same time, it should not make us think that our own ideas, our own implementation of these values are not valid.
I think, when you said that Salafism is compatible with democracy or compatible with election, I recall during the Arab Spring in Egypt, for example, it was the Salafi who basically was very much against the Arab Spring. They were really against Lebanon, and they were really against Arab Spring. But when they saw that there was a change in tide, that people are for reform and for this revolution of Arab Spring, then somehow or other they twisted they changed the allegiance by saying that we are going to compete in the election, right? And I think you have read about how much money the Saudi pumped into the Salafis in Egypt, and basically the Saudis were the one who caused the fall of Morsi himself. And I believe the same thing happened over here as well, because the hadith that you mentioned just now, even though it was it's questionable, but they still believe that you have to be to obey the leader, even though the leader is volume, and you have to obey him. And this similar narrative is here in this country, but somehow or other they evolve. I think this evolution of the Salafi is very important for us to understand, because I think that what they see is that for them to achieve power, it's a top-down kind of thing. For them to achieve power, then to change the community itself. And I do not think that when you say that because they don't have enough money now, then the influence is basically watered down or something like that. We had our fellow in Bosnia, and he has been arguing to me. Now, basically, Bosnia is a Salafi country. I think the influence is, even in the States and in Canada, you go to any mosque, you can find their tafsir, their translation of the Quran, this Hilali Khan Quran, so on and so forth. So I think that there must be a way. I want to know what would you propose for the Muslims, or for the reformists to. What is your plan to go against this tide?
Salafis in Egypt. The fact is that some Salafis, we have to distinguish between different strands. Saudi Salafis were against the Arab Spring. They were against any kind of rebellion, and they did it for political reasons, of course. And they considered, of course, and even their fatwa in that sense is really, I would say, childish, because they consider protest to be rebellion, and it's not. Like, if you actually protest without any arms, how can you call it rebellion? But they considered any demand for the change of government to be basically sedition. In Egypt, some of the Salafis stuck with, they said we're not allowed to change the government, and some of the Salafis actually engaged in politics. And there was disputes between them. So one of the biggest contenders for the presidency, who was not allowed to run for president because of other procedural reasons, but his name is Hazm Salah Abu Ismail. He's currently in jail. He was imprisoned after the coup, after Morsi was removed. So it was very interesting to see Salafis try to answer the question. They try to basically say how, if this is the world right now of going to live in a democratic world, how do we reinterpret? And this is something that's healthy, I believe, because once the political context changes, they will be forced to do some reforms. They're forced simply because they're forced to coexist with a different political reality. As for the question about the influence of Salafism worldwide, it's not going to, the influence of Salafism is not going to go away very quickly. It is a fact that with the rise of the current Saudi crown prince, who of course he's a terrible human being for many reasons, but when it comes to this point, he actually did stop all funding for all Salafi or Wahhabi establishment across the world. The problem is that Salafism won at an epistemological level. In other words, for the last 40 years, and this 40 years was not innocent. The 40 years is a very important phase because within those 40 years, there was a great expansion in population across the Muslim world, and also a great expansion in literacy across the Muslim world, which means that for an entire generation of Muslims, their exposure to religious knowledge has been Salafized. And this does not go away very easily. During the Arab Spring, and because I was very much plugged into the events and the intellectual debates at the time, I could notice that there is a very strong sense of anti-Salafism in the Arab world. There is a very strong grassroots sense of anti-Salafism at the time, because the Arab Spring was kind of a period in which everything was put up to question. So a lot of people were asking a lot of questions. There was a lot of intellectual evolution, and there were lots of groups, different kinds of, even intellectuals who co-organize online, whose main message is basically anti-Salafi. Unfortunately, because of the events of the counter-revolution, as you mentioned, the removal of Mursi, and which is something against the Saudi government and the Emirati government as well, gave a lot of money for. It's almost as if we were having this very, very fruitful conversation, and then someone hit pause. The whole debate was basically put on hold, because when it's one thing for you to discuss an idea because it's an idea that can be implemented in real life. The moment it becomes theoretical, people don't feel like it's an urgency to discuss it anymore. As for you say about the solution here, I think there's a very important measure of. I think we have to first contend to the fact that the reason why Salafism won is because it's won at an epistemological level. What I mean by that is that the way that we access religious knowledge, as I mentioned, I said rules. We look at it as rules, but actually, I would actually read a little bit from my notes here about what I mean by Salafi epistemology. If you give me a moment. So first is a tendency to look at religion as rules. Second is to look at religion as tradition, which means that anything new is bid'ah. Third is to emphasize hadith more than the Quran. And again, when I used to be a Salafi, we used to say, our even teachers used to say, that the Quran needs the hadith doesn't need the Quran. Next is an idea that reason is inferior to tradition. And I'm not saying inferior to revelation, because we don't disagree. We believe that, revelation, the word of God is of course better than our word. But an idea that reason is inferior to tradition. So if someone in the past said it, you cannot disagree. Next is the idea that Islam is not universal. It's unique and cultural. It's ours and not everybody's. Then is the idea that Islam is a total system. When I say total system, I mean there's rules for everything. And if you fill in the blanks, if you try to fill in the blanks using your own intellect or your own conscience, then you're basically doing bid'ah. And perhaps the big question is a matter of morality. Basically, that everything is law. Everything is permissibility versus non-permissibility, rather than. So it's basically legality comes on top of morality, or everything that's morality is reduced to legality. And of course, I can go into details of from the point of view of fiqh, what it means, or what these selections mean, or what they do. But eventually, it's really because this attitude has been universalized, basically been globalized among Muslims. It doesn't matter where you are. If you proceed to the text from that point of view, you're going to come to the same conclusion. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that you cannot argue with a paradigm from within that paradigm, because the paradigm will always win. In other words, for us to actually be the most effective, for example, the most effective anti-Salafi voices that I've heard or came across. Interestingly, a lot of them are ex-Salafis, so they actually are very familiar with the tradition. A lot of them are persecuted. One of them is in jail. He's actually been referred to a death sentence in Saudi Arabia. And interestingly, there's certain things in common between them. One of them is that they're a very critical look at tradition, and they take a critical look at hadith. And not in a sense that they reject hadith, but in a sense that they put the Quran above the hadith. So this project is a big project, of course. It's not a project for one brain. It's not a project for one institution. But I think that what's important for us to realize is that the social context around this is very important. The political context around it is very important. For example, I mean, a lot of the material on this topic I prepared in 2014, 2015, or even 2013. Since then, with dictatorship in the Arab region becoming very aggressive, my own activism, my own activities have basically been shifted more towards anti-dictatorship and promotion of human rights, mainly because, as I mentioned with the example of the Salafis in Egypt, when you're discussing something which is a practical possibility, then you're forced to contend with it. You're forced to actually come to a conclusion. You're forced to actually take that debate forward. If it's simply theoretical and the political reality does not allow you to do anything with this, then it remains theory, and there's no development in thought. There's no serious debate. So I think that if we want to accomplish that goal of an Islamic Renaissance, as you say, we need to initially focus completely on political rights and on opposing dictatorship, because without that, nothing is possible.
Why does dictatorship why are we seeing that rise? Why does it exist? Why is it so attractive?
I'm just interested to know if you could go back to the different types of Muslims that you mentioned just now. And
Speak louder, I can't hear.
to the different types of Muslims that Iyad was mentioning just now. And how does that come into play? Because you're saying that they're in this, so to speak, race of fighting to be the voice of the Ummah.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how does that come into play when you discuss it politically? Like, at this point, who do you think which side is winning?
Okay.
Or and in this fight for defining Islam as a universal value, where does this fit in? And is it Islam as a faith structure? What does it mean to be universal? Do we need this, so to speak, voice of Ummah that speaks for everybody?
It is my belief that if we look at the different kinds of Islams, although I understand where identitarian Islam is coming from, I believe that identitarianism is rising across the world, but identitarian Islam is against the idea that this is a universal faith. Maybe if you are living in Malaysia, in a Muslim country, you will not feel this as much as you feel it when you live in a Western country where Muslims are a minority and there's so much assimilation pressure. The reason why they emphasize their differences is because they want to protect it's basically a self-defense, protection kind of mechanism. So it's understandable. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm against it. I understand it, But at the same time, I say that this cannot be, it's a reaction. It's not proactive, it's reactive. When it comes to activist Islam, there's a lot of criticism coming from traditionalism to activists, to Muslim activists, because activism forces you to focus on the most universal things. This is especially an issue right now with the United States, where there's a new generation of Muslim politicians that are going into politics. We have, two Muslim women congresswomen who are basically joining the Congress this January. And you have to be able to campaign with Jewish groups, with Christian groups, with evangelical groups, with LGBT groups, because that's what happens when you live in a democracy and you live in a diverse society. You need to be able, and when you're an activist, basically, You cannot say that I'm going to support social justice for some people but not for others. You cannot say I want to support social justice or welfare or healthcare, etc., for only my group and not others. So it forces you to be more universal. The problem is that, or the fear over here is that, the traditionalist fear is that this is going to come at the expense of the orthodoxy. And of course, in this case, I think we really need to look at the orthodoxy itself. We have to look at the orthodoxy and see how much of it is really valid, or how much of it is really, something that we cannot question. You had another question?
Yeah, and who do you think is winning?
Who's winning?
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I don't think anybody is winning right now. However, when you look at, unfortunately, we don't have good surveys in the Muslim world. And I think it'll be very interesting to have a survey where you ask Muslims who do they trust more, and you list different categories. But I know, for example, that in the West, when they arranged all different professions and they ask who is the most corrupt and who is the least corrupt, policemen, I think, are always looked at the most corrupt. Businessmen are always looked as corrupt. And journalists and activists are looked at as least corrupt. Religious leaders, it depends upon the country, but in many countries they're also towards they're not seen as corrupt. We don't have good statistics, and I think it's important, I think it'll be interesting to actually do that. But I can tell you that, what I can predict over here is that if the traditionalist establishment does not find its own independence, and if it continues to try to keep favor with very tyrannical dictatorial regimes, it's going to be shooting its own legitimacy. It's going to be hurting its own legitimacy. And this is happening, actually. Recently there was a conference in Abu Dhabi, which is called the Peace Conference, and some very famous Islamic scholars, including Hamza Yusuf, bin Bayya, and a lot of different Muslim voices from around the world were collected. Basically they convened over there. And they convened in the United Arab Emirates, and they bestowed praise over the United Arab Emirates and its crown prince. And this is a country which is starving Yemen. It is bombing a neighboring country. It is imprisoning human rights activists. It is colluding with the Saudi regime when it comes to its own persecution of women's rights activists. So, what does it mean for me as a Muslim, when I see that my most respected religious leaders, either they don't know that this is a dictatorship, or they don't care, or they're lying? It's a very deep question, and I'm at peace with it, because I don't really, my faith is not dependent on these kind of figures. But I could see that there are many Muslim young people who are really having a meltdown. They're having a public meltdown over something like this. They're like, what does it mean to my faith? Because if my faith is traditional, what does it mean if I cannot trust any traditional figures today? So that'll be my answer for that. As for your question, that's kind of you need an anthropologist to answer that question. But generally speaking, the more the power distance there in a society, the more it is subject to top-down rule. In other words, a society, if we select PhDs from across the world, 50 men, 50 women, okay, and we select them all to be, highly intelligent, and we select them all to be very fit, and all of them, they have black belts in martial arts, okay, and they have the same amount of resources, and we send them to create a colony on Mars or something. Do you think it's going to be a dictatorship? I don't think so, because they're all kind of equal, They're all of the same level of physical strength, of resources, and of intelligence, and of skills. So I think eventually they're going to come up with some kind of democratic system. However, if we do the same, and we send 3 people who are strong, have all the resources, and have all the money, and we send a lot of people, like 97 people who are, weak and underprivileged, etc., then you can imagine some kind of dictatorship happening, right? What's happening in the world today is that we're seeing some of the greatest rise in education and literacy and in financial, I mean, people are being lifted out of poverty. Of course, the inequality is still very high, economic equality is still very high, but there's one thing to say about inequality and there's one thing to say about extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is basically reducing, so social mobility is increasing. And this clashes against traditional power structures or, top-down kind of power structures. Another factor, again, if you talk about the rise of authoritarianism right now, the fact is that when we're afraid, we become more accepting of authoritarianism. If there's a fire in the building, someone comes in and screams at you and says, get out, you're not going to say, no, I have my own opinion. You're going to follow, right? In other words, when it's a matter of fear, you are more likely to follow rules. You're more likely to follow instructions, right? When you feel at peace, when you feel actually completely safe and secure, that's when you're actually more relaxed and you're more likely to be more critical in your thinking, right? There are many reasons for people feeling more afraid nowadays. I think the media is part of it. But there's also like structural reasons, basically. There's terrorism, there's refugee waves, etc. There's a lot of war. And for that reason, the more afraid we are, the more accepting we become of authoritarianism, and the less compassionate we become. The more, the fear impulse also makes us look for the comfort of the tribe, the comfort of the group, which actually boosts also identitarianism. And as you notice, these things are not unique to Islam. There are very universal things happening across the globe. It's just that we have to ask ourselves the question, I mean, is our faith a tradition that we have to follow, or is it a set of spiritual values and principles that I can implement in every aspect of my life? So even when I ask myself about that, I have to ask myself, what pleases God more? And what rule can I create for myself? I don't have to go to a faqih in this particular context. I mean, of course, in certain cases, yeah, I mean, there are matters in which I will need a faqih for the big questions, for example, about, mu'amalat, or for example, about, marriage or talaq, or financial transactions, or worship, or salat, etc. But for many other things, I should be more than willing to be able to ask myself, how do I implement this value in my life? About hadith. The thing about us when it comes to talking about the rules is that we look at all of the rules as undifferentiated, even though some of the rules come from the Quran, some of the rules come from hadith, and some of the rules come from qiyas or human scholarship. But when we deal with the rules, a lot of the time we don't differentiate, and therefore we might be emphasizing something which is actually of a much lesser epistemological value. Epistemology here is very important because, a lot of the earliest Muslim scholars were epistemologists, where basically they're concerned with how do we know. How many hadiths were in circulation at the time of Imam Ahmad, for example? Imam Ahmad's son claimed that his father by hearted between 750,000 to 1 million hadiths. And we know that there aren't that many sahih hadiths. How many sahih hadiths are there if we take all of them together, put together from all the different ashah? Less than 10,000. So out of 1 million, you have 1%, which is hadith, which is sahih. And I would dispute that figure. I think it might be closer to 8,000. How many of these are mutawatir? And the tawatur in hadith means that it's a hadith that has a very thick sanad. It's not in dispute, it's basically common knowledge. Certain hadith scholars have said that there is no mutawatir hadith. None of the hadith are mutawatirs. And the one who is most permissive, which is Sayuti, counted 310. So you're talking 1 million, 10,000, 310 maximum. Hadith, if you actually study hadith methodology, hadith is probabilistic in nature, which means that we basically say la yufidul ilm. Hadith is not certain. We give it a rating saying that we think that the sanad is sahih. But we cannot, even the most correct hadith is inferior, epistemologically inferior to the Quran. there's another factor to consider, which is that the hadith, when we take the Quran is context. There are certain things where the Quran will tell you the whole story. You can read the Quran, you can read the context of the verse from beginning to end, so that you can understand what that verse means. A lot of the hadith does not give you that, because it will be one thing that the Prophet said. Sometimes that same thing that the Prophet said contradicts something else, another hadith which is also sahih. It's actually not contradictory, because we don't know the context. We don't know why and when the Prophet said this, and why and when the Prophet said this. In some cases we do, because the hadith will tell you, but in other cases you don't. This is why it's very important to emphasize that, talking about Salafism, Quran first. The moment we treat the hadith as having the same epistemic value as the Quran, first of all, we're doing an injustice to the Quran, but we're also doing something which is logically wrong.
I read the book translated was translated from this well-known Saudi scholar. I think Imam, what's his name? Imam, it escaped my mind. But anyway, he was trying to say that you have to put a top between hadith and Quran. And that's where the epistemology problem is. You say that they want.
Yeah, this is actually one of the factors of Salafism, that they make it equality.
Yeah, they make it equal. So I think the thing that we should do now is that to emphasize again on this epistemological basis of this.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, otherwise, they're going to win the war.
Absolutely. If you want to debate a Salafi in that case, if you accept the Salafi epistemology, you will never win the argument. Because you will always, if you accept their premises, they're going to win the argument. And this is why I say that the debate has to happen at the level of the epistemology. That's very important.
I think this also answers kind of your question about the future strategy, what needs to be done. It does hold that direction, that what intellectual direction the Muslim thought.
Absolutely.
Or Muslim
we were here at the discussion with Ziauddin Sardar.
That's right, last week. Yes.
Last week.
Yeah.
And I noticed, I think there was a question where there was a debate between him and one of the guests. Right. I can't remember what it was about, but and this was my comment. I was respectfully, I didn't want to mention that, but I wanted to say that if you accept that argument without discussing the epistemology behind it, the other person will always win the argument. Actually, quite mainstream among Salafism.
Yeah.
And whenever you discuss it, they will refer to certain verses of the Quran, which again, if you go to the Quran and read the whole thing in context, it doesn't really, it doesn't give you that meaning.
I don't want to start a new topic, but just maybe almost a yes or no answer, if you just can provide. You almost said, like, you talked about intent and not the rules. So there's also very rich intellectual tradition, which is called maqasid.
Yeah.
So in your scheme of things, is maqasid is the same, which started from Imam Ghazali, or this is you're talking about something else?
Yeah, no, maqasid, I mean, my favorite scholar of maqasid is actually Tahir bin Ashur, who's basically a Tunisian scholar. Who lived, I can't remember when he died. But the maqasid.
Very recent scholar.
No, he's not recent. He's not recent, no. But he wrote basically about maqasid al-sharia. And keep in mind that when we say maqasid al-sharia, we have to make it distinct from ghayat al-Quran. The Quran itself has, so maqasid is a more specific set than the ghayat. And the reason why I like the maqasid is that maqasid, or kulliyat, they say kulliyat al-sharia, is that the intention of the sharia is those preservation of 5 things, basically life, faith, family, progeny, and property. If you take these, you will find almost a complete match with the fundamental rights in the human rights paradigm. In a sense that these are called fundamental rights, and they're basically distinct from other rights in a sense that they're legal and immediately enforceable. So the maqasid is normally cited not for, they're mostly cited for political reasons, to say that we have to create a state that implements the maqasid. And this is how many, including Muslim Democrats such as Rashid Ghannouchi from Tunisia also, when they talk about Muslim democracy, they mean a state. This is how they make they can look at a liberal state as also being an Islamic state because it implements the maqasid. What I'm talking about is, of course, this, but also a lot more, because I'm talking about going to the level of saying, let's look at the entire Quran and let's look at all the values which the Quran promotes, and let's see, let's see how we can implement these values in real life and how we can use these values to legislate. An important distinction here is that if you ask Salafi scholars about the maqasid, they will tell you, that means today's Salafi scholars, but also traditional scholars, they will tell you that you can only use them in one direction. In other words, you can only use the maqasid in order to provide apologetics for the Sharia. You're not allowed to use the maqasid to contradict a rule. In other words, you can only use the maqasid in order to agree with an existing rule and not to disagree with an existing rule. And this is something that I believe is wrong.
Okay.
We will not actually be able to use the maqasid the way that I believe they're intended to be used unless we can legislate from the maqasid, which is currently not the case.
Today's whole discussion, you talked very much about the universal values that exist in the Quran, and I think it's important actually that we end on that. What are those values?
Well, this is a big question, because in that case you have to, the project really, or my project, is to go to the Quran verse by verse. Interesting thing, when I said that the Quran doesn't have a lot of rules, and you have 6,236 verses, and only maybe a maximum of like 400 or 500 have rules. If you look at values, it's the opposite, because every verse will have will have values. And some verses will have multiple values. You'll be able to extract multiple values from one rule. Of course, it's also the fact that you can extract multiple rules from the same verses as well. So it's a big project. But I consider the Quran.
What have you
I consider the Quran's main value, or the king, let's say, or the queen of all Islamic values is truth. Or that kind of epistemology, basically. That's why the worst thing to call someone in the Quran is kafir, which is facts denier. Someone who knows the truth and then knows the truth but still does not accept it. So I believe very strongly that the Quran's moral system is based upon, of course, compassion is there, disgust is also there when it comes to khabith and tayyib. But I think the Quran emphasizes honesty. I believe more than anything else.
I think we need to conclude here, and I wish Ayad the best of luck for your very ambitious project, and if I could name it as a rediscovery or of a theory of morality within the Muslim thought process.
Yeah, that'll be a big that'll be a big project. But yeah,
that will be a big project.
Yeah.
But stay safe. Most important, and keep working and keep us engaged. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Here today.
Thank you.
We finished this talk.
Yeah.